Can you do the next one?
All right, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. Everybody's in the meeting, so we are going to start. My name is Yasmin Jassim, and I'm working for the RAN for a couple of years now. I'm supporting the RAN Young Working Group and the RAN Local Working Group, which I will tell you something about later on. Before we are going into the content of this webinar on preventing and countering violent extremism, I would like to give you a little bit of background on RAN in general, so Radicalization Awareness Network, and on RAN Young. Let me see. So what is the RAN? The RAN is the Radicalization Awareness Network, and within this network we bring together practitioners from around Europe working on prevention of radicalization. So RAN is a network for frontline grassroots practitioners from around all Europe, and they work daily with people who have already been radicalized or are vulnerable for radicalization. So this can be police officers, prison authorities, but you could also think about teachers or youth workers, civil society representatives, also local authorities, representatives, healthcare professionals. These people, they come together within the RAN working groups, in which they share knowledge and first-hand experiences with each other. They review each other's practices, they learn from each other. So we have different working groups, which you can see on the slide. We have the working group for police. We have one for youth and for education, so for teachers, youth workers. One for prison workers, rehabilitation, family workers, community workers, local authorities. We've also have a working group for victims of terrorism, one for communication online and offline, and one on mental health. So let me continue to the introduction of RAN Young. So next to these 9 working groups, we have the RAN Young platform, which is a platform for young people to engage them within RAN on the one hand, and on the other hand, to learn from them. So with RAN Young, RAN aims to engage young actors between 18 and 25 years old like yourselves, who are already engaged in prevention of violent extremism or related activities. And these young people, so yourselves, you could be the future youth workers, teachers, police officers, policymakers, leaders, but at this moment already, you are the change makers, you may be community leaders, but also credible voices to other young people and experts when it comes to the perception and reality of young people. So it's 2 ways around. So on one hand, we would like to have young people involved within RAN, so we could pass this knowledge that is already out there onto the next generation, but we also need the perspectives, the knowledge, and the ideas of young people within RAN. Right. Before I'm going to pass the word on to Kelsey Bjornskaart from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, who is our key speaker of today, I would like to give some practical hints. So very practical. If you have any questions, please use the chat. Kelsey might ask you to ask this question yourself. She will also let you know when you can ask questions, but just put everything you have in the chat. Please mute yourself so we don't hear any noises, any background noises. And finally, this webinar will be recorded and published, but only the parts in which our key speaker, Kelsey, is talking. So your names, your contributions, nothing of this will be shared. All right, I hope you will enjoy it. I'm going to pass the word on to Kelsey Bjornskaart, and let's see how far we come today. Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well.
Excellent. Hi. Let me see if I can get my screen sharing to work. Let's see. All right. Is this working? Can you see the correct screen and only one screen?
We see only one screen now, that's fine.
Great. Okay, excellent. Thank you everybody for being here, and thank you to Ran Young for having me. Should be really exciting. So I'll jump straight into it. So today's session is just going to be sort of an overall introduction to preventing and countering violent extremism. And I'll give kind of more of a detailed overview of what we're going to be doing in a second. But first, a little bit on kind of who I am. So I work with an organization called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. So ISD is a counter-extremism organization that works to prevent and counter extremism of all kinds worldwide. So as an organization, ISD takes a holistic approach. So this involves research, networks, policy, communication, technology, and governance. So ISD in this work works really closely with a lot of different actors. So that includes, NGOs and CSOs, local and national governments, big private sector firms. So we work with Facebook, Google, Twitter, Microsoft, so social media companies. But I think sort of most critically, ISD also works with young people. So we work with youth activists globally to empower them to become leaders in their communities and in peace building worldwide. So this is my role. I work with young activists in Europe, Africa, South Asia, and the MENA region. And my main job is to provide training and offer direct support. So that's both strategic support, but also financial and logistical support. So that young people in all of these different places can lead their own responses to the challenges of hate and violence and polarization that face the young people in their communities. So in this work, over the last 5+ years, I guess, I've led more than 40 workshops and trainings in 20 different countries across 4 continents, all for young activists like yourselves. So I'm really excited to be part of this webinar and to be here today with you and Ran Young. So I've worked with Ran Young in the past, and it's an absolutely fantastic program. So I'm really glad for you, and you should be really happy for yourselves that you're going to be a part of that this year. So hopefully this is a good introduction to the program and a little bit of what to expect. So just to speak, sort of give a little bit of background, I guess, on the role that young people have played in preventing and countering violent extremism. So you may have heard of this resolution by now. If not, you certainly will going forward. But UN Resolution 2250 was really a paramount moment in changing the way that young people were viewed and sort of discussed and included and even thought about in extremism and in preventing and countering violent extremism. It's actually, still pretty exceptional that young people are given the space that they are to take on more of a leadership role, because it's not something that youth had for a long time. In the lead up to 2015, obviously there were a lot of young activists that were incredibly vocal and incredibly active in this space, and were doing so much within their communities to create really positive change. But if you look at the way that young people were discussed and thought about in international circles, it was always in 2 ways, either as perpetrators or as victims, or somewhere in between where you had someone who was vulnerable and was likely to become a perpetrator. So obviously both of these views were incredibly disempowering to young people and incredibly discouraging to the young people who were so actively involved in peace building. Because violent extremism is a global threat, and while it is true that extremist groups are getting younger and younger, state responses that target youth and securitize being young were not the answer. So in the same way that unemployment may be a driver in some places, it doesn't mean that a person's automatically a threat because they don't have a job. Forms of religious extremism are always going to be identified with a particular religion, but it doesn't make you a target just because you have faith. Extremist groups may target young people, but it doesn't mean that you are violent just because you were young. So this was never a sustainable approach. Our societies need better, and as the future of our societies as young people, we deserve better. But what was clear was that better was never going to be handed to us, and that we had a responsibility to create the community in which we want to live. And it's a responsibility that I know everyone in this program takes very seriously. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here giving us, 2 hours of your time on a Tuesday. And I mean, as excuse me, as Yasmin already said, that you are the experts here. You have the knowledge, you have the drive, you have the understanding, and most importantly, you have the voice of a leader already. What we hope to do, and I think largely what this program hopes to do, is to give you the skills and processes and support to make your work more effective. And the fact that these kind of programs can exist really kind of comes back to this resolution 2250 that really changed the way a lot of international bodies and organizations and funding bodies, very importantly, thought about the role of youth in PCVE. And it's been a pretty incredible journey over the last 5+ years to kind of build on that momentum. So you really are, coming in and becoming part of a global movement that's really something quite incredible. So today's webinar, just to give sort of an overview of what we're going to be doing today. So typically when I do workshops, I do them on a fairly wide variety of topics, but usually they're very focused on specific skills. But today, since there is quite a wide range of activists here, and you all represent pretty different contexts, the Ranyang team has asked me to lead a more sort of generalized workshop on extremism and different approaches to preventing and countering extremism. So that's what we're going to do today. So we'll go through kind of the ins and outs of extremism and different approaches to PCVE. Now, just to say, and hopefully this is clear, since we do only have 2 hours today, it's not going to be exhaustive. There's so much to talk about and think about and discuss and work through on this topic that we could sit here in front of our computer for weeks and still have things left to talk about. So unfortunately, it's not going to be comprehensive, but hopefully it's going to be sort of a good starting point. And that's more than anything just what I hope to be able to bring across through this, is just give you a good starting point to really start thinking about these things together. So that you have kind of a shared understanding right from the beginning going into this program that you can build on together and kind of really create something that is your own. So there is going to be bouts of me talking, but there will also be chances for discussion and a little bit of group work. So obviously, webinars make it a little bit harder to really have kind of good discussions compared to what it would be if we were offline. But we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. And if at any point you have a question or even a comment, just put it in the chat box and we'll discuss it. So I'll try to check the chat box kind of in between sections, I guess, more or less, and try to keep the discussion going as much as possible. Yeah, hopefully that's clear, and hopefully this is really useful for everybody. So we can go ahead and get started. All right, so to begin with, before we can really start figuring out how to counter extremism, we need to make sure we understand what extremism is. And this is no easy feat, no less because it's an incredibly complex and variable issue, but also much in the same way that terrorism doesn't necessarily have one concrete definition rather. Extremism doesn't either. So there isn't one single definition that everybody adheres to and follows. It's a term that it's still growing, it's still evolving. Our understanding of it is still evolving. And while there are a lot of elements that cross over that we can understand, that we can all agree upon, it's still something that is, in discussion. So what I thought we would start with first is getting into our breakout groups very quickly and talking about what you think extremism is. What does it mean to you? What does it include? What does it not include? you know, maybe even kind of this idea of whether or not extremism is always bad. That's so these are some of the topics. Let me see how much time we have for this. So unfortunately, again, time is a little bit tight. So you're going to have 5 minutes in your breakout groups, which I know isn't a ton, but to come up very quickly with a shared definition. So what is your definition for what extremism is and what does it include? And then we can discuss those kind of as a bigger group when you come back. So if everybody, I think you've been given instructions and the link to be able to join your groups, but if you need a reminder of which group you're in, here it is. So just follow that link. This, I think, call will be paused. You'll be able to get into your groups. And then after 5 minutes, please come back to this group so we can stay kind of on track and on time. Yeah, so go ahead and join your groups. There we go. All right, hopefully everybody's seeing the correct screen. All right. Yeah, so everybody came out with some really, really good definitions that hit on some really important points. So yes, you've now already seen this, but this is sort of ISD's, this is sort of a slimmed down version of ISD's definition. So it's the advocacy of a system of belief that posits the superiority and dominance of one in-group over all out-groups. So this idea that it's, you know, in-group versus out-group, and it's not just that you believe yourself to be part of one group, that you are superior to all others. So propagating a dehumanizing, othering mindset that's antithetical to the universal application of human rights. And then extremist groups advocate through explicit and more subtle means for a systematic change in society that reflects their own worldview. So a lot of these ideas were present in your definitions already, but sort of a key thing that one group hit on, so it's not necessarily extremist to hold certain ideas, but it's the lengths to which you're willing to go to act on those ideas and force those ideas on others or see those ideas reflected in the society more broadly. And it involves that inherent and unconditional belief that the in-group survival is linked to hostile action against the out-group. So this idea that the group that you're a part of is for some reason at risk, and that there is either one specific or maybe more than one specific group that is threatening, and that there is a sort of sense of urgency to protect the group. So this can include a wide range of behaviors from discrimination to violence. So one group hit on that it doesn't always necessarily include violence. You can have extremism without violent extremism. And that's why I think it's really good to start with the E and VE and really focus on understanding what's extremism first and knowing that violence is sort of one of many different, I hate to call it a tool, but tools that extremists will use in some circumstances. So one group hit on as well that there's a lot of different types of extremism. So there's quite a few different ideologies. So most of them are probably familiar. So you have along the political spectrum, you have left-wing and right-wing extremism. There's ethno-nationalist and separatist, religiously motivated extremism, and then also single issue. And when we say single issue, we mean things like environmental extremism. So it's extremism that's focused on, as it says, one single issue, but addressing a very specific cause. And environmental extremism is one of those that's quite interesting, that because you can completely agree with what their sort of worldview is and what their goal is and what they're hoping to accomplish, but still take issue with the means they're willing to use to reach that goal. And that's where you hit that distinction between it's not just the idea, it's the action you're willing to take to enact that idea. And I think that's a really clear one that you see with like environmental extremism in particular. So in addition to the sort of different ideologies, there's also specific trends. So ISD does a lot of research on extremism, and these are some of the really important trends that our researchers have been observing over the last few years. So a really key one is reciprocal radicalization and cumulative extremism. So this is this idea when antagonistic extremist movements, they feed off of one another and they fuel each other's rhetoric. So within Europe, for example, you'll see this a lot between far right and white nationalist groups and Islamist extremist groups, that when one not group per se, but an adherence of sort of one form of extremism. Maybe there's some sort of violence or there's an attack or something like that. It will always feature in the propaganda and the recruitment narratives of other extremist groups. So they take the other's actions as evidence of the threat that they and their group is under, and they take that as justification for needing to take extreme action. We've seen the mainstreaming of the far right, and you see this a lot online, but also offline. So formerly fringe groups, they're entering more and more into the mainstream. They're kind of coming out more and more into the open, and having the confidence to spread their ideologies, their symbolism, their ideas, their narratives very openly. So if you, for example, look at the way that Islamist extremists behave online versus the way the far right extremists or white nationalist extremists will behave online, the latter group are much more open. They're a lot more candid. They're much more likely to have, like traditional far right symbols in their photos, things like that. They're very, very open about it, and they seem to feel very comfortable being open about it. But we've also seen that this is increasingly entering into the mainstream political sphere as well. And we've seen there are specific governments that have been fostering this mainstreaming in the far right. And even if it's not the ruling power that is actively putting in place policies, it may be that they are catering more and more to fringe right voters, allowing the party to sort of creep further and further to the right, or creating more space for what had been formerly fringe and extremist voices. There's been an internationalization of extremist movements in all ideologies. And some of this comes down to communication technology, social media, the internet. It's a lot easier for what had been sort of siloed groups that were kind of working on their own to build up more into a global movement. With increasingly varied opportunities for recruitment and engagement. So this has obviously made, things like, PVE and CVE much more difficult because of the widespread nature. But of course, all of these tools that have made this internationalization of extremism possible are also tools that we can use in combating it. Populism, hopefully, is a term, well, not hopefully, unfortunately, is a term that I think everybody's incredibly familiar with by now. It's that thin-centered ideology that separates society into antagonistic camps. Excuse me. And then there's been sort of a political and social polarization of where the far right and the far left are largely feeding off of each other, and you see this separation of political groups, and you see the shrinking of the middle ground. And even where in reality, oftentimes it's not that these polls have necessarily gotten larger, although in most cases they have, they've certainly gotten louder. And even in cases where maybe the numbers don't necessarily support that there has been this total polarization politically into different camps, it at least creates an antagonistic sort of like situation that it has. So these are just some of the trends that have been really, really important. And as a consequence of all of this is you're starting to see more and more isolation of vulnerable communities. So communities that have been othered by extremist movements, they can become more isolated, and they can become increasingly vulnerable to radicalization, because it creates a very fertile ground for, victim narratives or, injustice. And we're going to get into, some of these push and pull factors a little bit later, but a lot of these things can, these factors can come as a result of some of these trends. And this is really kind of that important part of the reciprocal radicalization, is that as groups are more and more othered and are not, sort of protected, it can make them more vulnerable. So when we're talking about extremism, who is an extremist is it's a conversation that's really changed over the last several years, because more and more we're realizing there is no single profile for who an extremist is. This term at-risk populations is more and more difficult and more problematic because it's hard to know what is going to make an individual be at risk, because so much of it is individual factors. And what an extremist is can look very different within, single groups, within single ideologies. If you look at recruitments for ISIS, for example, I mean, that has largely sort of debunked this idea that the typical at-risk typical at-risk recruit is someone who's had very, very little education, when in reality, a lot of, quite a few of the foreign fighters that were joining ISIS were highly educated and were affluent and were coming from, if not backgrounds of privilege, at least very comfortable backgrounds. So a lot of these factors that we had previously thought sort of made foreign extremists have largely been thrown into question. So this idea, and this question of who is an extremist is something that's incredibly complicated, but it's also just very unique and needs to be sort of understood almost on an individual level. And I say all this just to hopefully give a sort of persistent reminder that when you're thinking about these things, you have to do so with a lot of nuance, and you have to do so with a very critical eye. Because unfortunately, there just aren't any single profiles. There aren't really any easy answers to this. It's going to take sort of a lot of searching and kind of like building up personalized understandings. So what do we mean when we talk about radicalization? So radicalization featured in several of your definitions, and it is a really important concept in extremism and in preventing and countering extremism. So radicalization, it's an incremental process of change. So it's extremist ideologies and ideas, they take hold within an individual or group. So when we talk about radicalization, we're talking about a process rather than an outcome. And then radicalization to violent extremism is an escalation of extremist orientation toward an outgroup as inferior and subhuman that demands hostile and violent actions against that outgroup for the protection of the in-group. So the way that radicalization sort of works, because again, it's a really, really individual process. Actually, let me go back one more. And each person's journey is ultimately unique. So there's plenty of models out there that have tried to help kind of capture this process. So you may have heard of the conveyor belt model, there's the staircase model, but ultimately it kind of comes down to how many different factors within the individual and within their environment converge to make them vulnerable. And that's what we talk about when we talk about push factors and pull factors. So you may have heard these terms before as well, especially if you studied any form of extremism or terrorism as part of your studies. But when we're talking about conditions that support radicalization, so that sort of key distinction of support is really important, because it doesn't necessarily mean a person will be radicalized. To say that a population or a person or group is at risk means that there may be conditions present that make them more vulnerable, but it doesn't necessarily mean that just because a person lives in or experiences one of these conditions or all of these conditions that they're necessarily going to, join an extremist group or, become violent. But this is just a good way of thinking about it, just to see that there is an interplay of a lot of different things that can affect a person. So when we talk about push factors, what we mean is we're looking at the things about the person that can lead them to radicalization. So these are the things that are present within the individual. So this might be a personal grievance or a sense of injustice. This is when, we're talking about issues of identity. Identity will come up kind of time and time again. Alienation, if the person or the group is feeling alienated, if, a person is searching for answers or searching for meaning, that can be a big driving factor. A drive for status, significance, excitement, there are socioeconomic factors. These are more prominent in some areas and in some populations, and are a more keystone part of the recruitment strategy for some groups than with others. But there are cases where socioeconomic factors sometimes are enough. And then there's also mental health or personal trauma. And then when we talk about pull factors, so what about the extremist group is drawing them in? So what about their sales pitch, about their recruitment is appealing to people? They might be offering an opportunity for justice or a sense of control, a sense of belonging and community that can reassure the self, explanations for the state of the world, society, their place, and their place within it, a sense of worth, a sense of adventure, urgency. Urgency is a really important part of mobilizing people, especially to violence, and then monetary incentives. So hopefully you noticed that the pull factors and push factors are often connected. So the pull factors, the sort of what an extremist group is offering will also often be in response to individual vulnerabilities. And a lot of their success will depend on how well they can map what they're offering onto those individual vulnerabilities and how well they can connect with the audience and give them the impression that they have some sort of answer or some sort of solution. There's also other considerations, so social factors and group dynamics that might exist within a community or within a society, conflicts, the presence of extremist groups or groomers. So we talk a lot these days about online radicalization, things like that. But in general, a lot of these things still happen through individual connections, personal connections. And while there is the possibility that somebody can become radicalized without the presence of an individual, it's more common that the presence of an extremist group or groomer is going to help facilitate that. And then education and critical thinking. So that is, while education does not solve for everything, education, and especially education that involves critical thinking, can help enhance a person's resilience. But I guess sort of the key factors with these sort of other considerations is extremist groups, they exploit instability. They're going to seek out cracks in society, and they're going to use their ideologies as a wedge to widen those cracks and catch the individuals that fall through them. So they're able to, they capitalize on things like conflict and war. They capitalize on failed integration, on social segregation, marginalization, all of these things that can build up grievances and senses of injustice, be they imagined or real, doesn't matter. They seize on these things and they can use them and exploit them to bring people into their ideology and radicalize them. And then often, the recruitment strategies that extremists use, they're not simple. It's not, you won't see their entire ideology poured into a video and then sent around the internet. I mean, they're really, really complex communication strategies that work directly and indirectly. They rely really heavily on disinformation to exacerbate existing conflicts, to create conflicts. They will create the instability they need to be able to pick off people who are then affected by it. And they create clear perpetrators and victims, and they offer opportunities to shift that balance. So people who feel victimized have the opportunity to do something about it, or people who feel, even just like they don't belong or they don't have any sense of purpose, they create an opportunity to make that a reality for that person. So this is just sort of a kind of broad, like I said, very broad overview. This is, especially with radicalization, we could spend, days and days and days unpacking this and still not have exhausted the topic. So hopefully this just gives a little bit of background. Now, for the rest of the webinar, we're going to now focus on preventing and countering violent extremism. So now that we hopefully have sort of a better understanding of extremism and some of the factors around it, there's this question of what can we do about it? Now, before we move on, let me stop sharing, so otherwise I can't see anything. Does anybody have any questions? All right. All right, somebody shout if this is showing the wrong screen or not working. Otherwise, I'll just assume it's doing okay.
I think it's doing okay.
Ah, amazing, thank you. All right, so what are we talking about when we talk about PVE and CVE, preventing and countering violent extremism? So countering violent extremism sort of as a term came first. Mind you, they're both recent. So countering violent extremism can really only be traced back maybe 10 years. And then preventing violent extremism is even more recent as a term. So countering violent extremism, that's where it's targeting at-risk individuals. So people who are showing initial signs or interest in a violent extremist group or ideology. And CVE initiatives and programs, they'll utilize critical engagement, providing counter narratives and alternative narratives through messaging, intervention, or community engagement. Whereas preventing violent extremism, it aims to stop the process of radicalization before it starts. So PVE initiatives, they're largely working to develop critical consumption skills, build awareness, try to address some of those conditions that we saw with the push and pull factors that might make a person or a group or a community more vulnerable. And help build up some of that resilience. So the key difference really with preventing versus countering is it's the programming that you're able to pursue. So PVE tends to be much broader. And PVE is one of those, it's hard to nail down because there's a lot of things that would help in working toward preventing radicalization that wouldn't necessarily fall under the sort of extremism category traditionally. So things like entrepreneurship and job development. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But PVE, so it tends to be quite broad. And it also targets a much, much broader audience. Whereas CVE, it's targeting a much narrower audience with really, really targeted specific campaigns and things as well, and really much more targeted initiatives. Excuse me. So when we're talking about sort of visualizing a CVE framework, and actually this should say PCVE framework, my apologies, but there's sort of 3 levels that we're kind of looking at. And this model is taken from health. So this is also sort of the model that people take when talking about health is when you're looking at primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions, looking at preventative methods versus like interventionary methods where you're actually at the point of having to like treat an illness versus preventing an illness. So if this is familiar to anyone who's been in and around the health field, that's why. But so kind of starting from the bottom, and the reason it's drawn up like a triangle, I don't know if everybody had the same sort of food chart that I had as a child, where they give you the food pyramid, where the foods you're supposed to eat more of that are more healthier in the bottom of the pyramid, and then you get like ice cream right in the tip of the pyramid because you really shouldn't have too much of it. So it's the same kind of visual cue here, that at the bottom of the pyramid is your primary interventions, because these are the ones that really should be getting the most time, the most focus, and the most funding, because they're the things, these preventative approaches, these are the ones that are really, really going to pay off in the long term. And the best thing you can do is to not have to do the tertiary because it's so much more difficult. So with primary, you're looking at prevention resilience building to create natural resiliences to violent extremism. And this is going to be against sort of like much larger kind of majority populations. So your goal with primary is to prevent the radicalization of individuals to begin with by promoting positive values, enabling peaceful and pluralistic societies. So addressing all of those conditions that could make people or groups more vulnerable. And this, as I said, it includes such a wide range of activities: education, capacity building, critical thinking, critical consumption, minimizing grievances, promoting positive values, encouraging engagement with other groups, civic participation, creating campaigns with content that informs or increases knowledge, increases skills, mobilizing, it goes on and on. So you can see the primary, there's a lot of things that fall into this, and there's a lot of different approaches that you can take to really deliver a really good preventative program. Now, when you get to the sort of the secondary level, this is more strategic engagement that's challenging extremist narratives and extremist ideas amongst what we call at-risk audiences. So these are the audiences that are actively questioning or seeking direction. They might be consuming extremist content already. And as I said earlier, the sort of at-risk audiences, they're difficult to identify, and they're oftentimes very difficult to engage with. And the reason secondary interventions, well, one of the reasons they are so difficult, is when you're dealing with a population that's at risk, you're almost always at risk of stigmatizing them. So it's being able to intervene and engage in a way that's really, really productive, that's not going to stigmatize or securitize a group of people. So the goal with secondary is to intervene with these at-risk individuals to help guide them away from extremist groups and ideas and ideologies, and prevent sort of further radicalization, and at the very least prevent radicalization to violence. So these kind of activities include counter-narratives, so counter-speech campaigns that are aimed at disrupting extremist propaganda, presenting alternatives, mediating and redirecting grievances, early stage intervention. So this can be through dialogue, mentoring, counseling, or it can also include diversionary activities that are meant to build resilience and break down alienation. So a really interesting example in, I think it was in Nottingham in England, there was a boxing program that worked not with extremism per se, but largely to prevent young men from being recruited into gangs. And it was started by a boxer who had been himself part of a violent gang. And he started this program to be able to engage with these sort of at-risk youth. And that's this idea of sort of, it's a diversionary program, but it's also building skills, it's creating a community, it's creating a safe space where they can, you know, discuss all of the things that are happening in their lives, where they may have otherwise been alienated and left vulnerable. Then when you get to the very top of the pyramid, well, very quickly, so with the secondary intervention, we're talking about a much narrower audience. So that's one of the big differences. Tertiary, so this is going to be directed interventions, and these are for people who are already engaged with extremist ideology or with an extremist group in some way. It may be that they have not committed any acts of violence. It may be that they have no intention of committing any acts of violence, but irregardless, they've become a part of some sort of extremist movement in some way. So the goal is to help encourage disengagement, but we have to be really careful with this idea of de-radicalization, because it's not really possible to de-radicalize a person if they don't want to be. So it's not about getting somebody to change their mind or change their ideas or to abandon an ideology, because unfortunately it's not that simple. You can't sit someone down in a chair and talk to them or show them videos or, you know, do whatever they do in films where they prop people's eyes open with toothpicks and rewire how they feel. So you can't actively de-radicalize a person necessarily. So I would just be very, very careful with sort of that term and that idea. But there's a lot of things that you can do to promote disengagement and help people get out when they want to get out. That's probably the biggest bulk of programs that take place in the tertiary intervention are helping people leave. So you may have heard of exit programs. So Exit Deutschland's a really big one. There's a big exit program in the US, Life After Hate. So there's a lot of exit programs, especially on the far right, for helping people leave white supremacist and neo-Nazi movements, because once you become integrated into one of these groups, it is actually very, very difficult to leave, and it's dangerous. So a lot of these programs are helping those people who've already come to the conclusion that they want to leave, or they're at that point where they're ready to start disengaging, and it's helping that process along. So the audience for the tertiary interventions is incredibly narrow. And as your audience gets more and more narrow, it requires a much better understanding of that audience and of their issues. Trust becomes a much bigger factor. Who the messenger is. So with those exit programs, you'll find that most of them are run by formers. Because formers have an understanding of the groups and of the communication strategies and the narratives, and they understand what people are going through on a level that nobody else ever could. And they can connect with them in a way that nobody else ever could because they've experienced it before. So as you move up the pyramid, it gets riskier, it gets more difficult, and it requires a much more targeted, specific approach, which is why it's a lot easier kind of for everyone involved to really, really focus on that primary intervention and hopefully eventually get to a point where the secondary and tertiary interventions are not as necessary. Now, where you all are, you will, obviously I don't know all of your experience, but for the most part, you will probably largely be focusing on primary interventions in a lot of the work that you're doing, and they're so crucial and so important to this field. So it's probably where a lot of your focus is going to be. But the key in all of this is, especially within the preventative sphere, is building resilience. That's going to be your key. Because you can't shield a person from all of the bad things in the world. You can't shield them from injustice. You can't, create a world in which they'll never have grievances or fears or vulnerabilities. But what you can do is you can help build up their resilience so that when they do encounter them, they have a better chance of not falling prey to them. They have they have the skills, they have the knowledge, they have the background, the confidence. They have all of these things that when they encounter, some of these external factors, or when they're wrestling with some of those internal factors inside of themselves, they have the tools to be able to deal with it, and they have the resilience to be able to resist some of these external manipulative forces. So that's going to be sort of the word of the day. It's resilience with most of these approaches. Now, there are a lot of different approaches to PCVE, especially PVE. But these are just sort of a handful of them, and I'm going to run through most of them pretty quickly, just because sake of time, and also, again, you don't want to sit in front of your computer for hours and hours on end listening to me talk. But do pay attention, because some of them are going to come up in the exercise. So I believe you've already been sent your exercise instructions, so you should know which of the approaches your group is going to be focusing on. But yeah, so I'll probably go into a little bit more detail on those. But in general, like I said, it's going to be a bit of a top line overview, because this is meant to be more of an introduction. But if you have like really specific questions, you want to know more about any of these, put your questions in the chat box. We'll either get to them today or I'll follow up in an email afterwards. So just to begin with, probably like one of the most common approaches to PVE is social cohesion and peace building. So these are programs that are going to address the conditions that are conducive to extremism that make communities or individuals vulnerable. So as I said earlier, extremist groups are really skilled at exploiting conflict, failed integration, injustices. And they make social strife fit their narrative, and they use those grievances to justify their actions and fuel their recruitment. So when you're talking about programs that are really focused on social cohesion, they're working to cut the fuel lines for extremist recruitment by addressing the underlying factors that could make a person vulnerable. So these programs, they work to make people feel they're part of the community, that society has a place for them, where they can have they have the same access to opportunities, that they have, the opportunity to create a future for themselves. They might resolve strife between groups. They can help a marginalized group feel seen or heard. They can humanize a group that extremists have built up as a scapegoat. And they can help resolve identity crises or create a sense of belonging. And to the point of with helping marginalized groups feel seen and heard, it's good to remember as well that PCV campaigns, they're not always for at-risk groups, and they're not always for potential perpetrators, or, you know, whatever you want to call them. You can also do PCV campaigns that help victims or help targeted communities, and can help, you know, give them the skills and the voice and the opportunity to stand back up for themselves. So sometimes social cohesion and peace building campaigns also include sort of a rebalancing, and it's working with those targeted communities and those victimized communities as well. And it's also, you know, oftentimes working with, you know, allies or others, or people who are, you know, they're not at risk, they're not in a victimized community, but they're part of a community, and they can help lend their support and help rebalance some of these things by getting involved. So some campaigns might also be convincing people who think that I'm not involved, this isn't my problem, that it is. This is something, you know, it is their problem, it is their community. It's up to them to take a stand on this. So there's a lot of different ways you can do these campaigns by talking to a lot of different audiences. Now, this is one where there is a risk of securitization. So there's a risk that you're going to stigmatize and alienate a population if you frame it as, you know, counter extremism. So it's like, we're doing this dialogue session to make sure that none of you become extremists. That's going to alienate the people that are involved. So you will see that a lot of social cohesion and peace building campaigns, they will not be labeled as PVE or CVE or even peace building. Not necessarily anyway, at least not publicly, maybe to the donor. But so you do have to be careful with how you label and pitch some of these. Another one is addressing grievances. So we know that extremists will capitalize on grievances to radicalize people and to mobilize them. So it's, again, it's spotting those cracks and then digging into them. So this is often linked to marginalization, discrimination, abuses, feelings of injustice, so corruption, you know, the distribution of funds or opportunities, jobs, a lack of transparency. There's a lot of different things that exist that will build up into grievances. And sometimes it's just how a person's been treated, or how they feel that the society treats them or sees them or views them, or the chance they think they have for building any sort of future. Grievances, very keyly, they, excuse me, they can be real or they can be imagined. It may be, oftentimes they are incredibly real, and creating a campaign that's going to address very real grievances can be really hard, because sometimes you don't have it in your power to change the thing that is creating the grievance. You can't necessarily change a policy overnight. You can't change hiring patterns overnight. There's things that you can do to try to affect those things. But part of the campaign can also be helping people deal with those grievances when they are real. But it's also the case sometimes that grievances are imagined, that a person feels that they've been the victim of something that, you know, maybe they actually haven't been. But if it's real to them, it's real enough. So be sure that whatever you're doing, you never deny a grievance. You can help, try to help people come to terms with it, to understand it, to sort of reimagine it, to take some sort of action. Just whatever you do, never deny a grievance, because you will lose credibility and trust, and you will lose that audience, usually for good. So activities in addressing grievances. So you can address grievances directly. You can offer alternative platforms for airing grievances. Sometimes it's enough just for people to feel heard. So if they feel like they have no voice, or their voice has been taken away from them, creating a platform for them can be really, really therapeutic. Dialogue sessions, where people can air their grievances directly. So dialogue sessions between youth and practitioners, so government, police, intergenerational. So if you have a group that feels like they've not been heard, giving them a chance to sit down and talk and feel heard to the group that they think is ignoring them, that can make a big difference. So these dialogue sessions. Trying to help enhance trust in society. Some of this can be education. So sometimes you get grievances toward governments that stem from a lack of civic education. So people will be angry at their government for not doing X, Y, Z, because they don't realize that the government's not responsible for X, Y, Z. They're actually responsible for A, B, C. So education can factor into this. Really cool program that we've seen through the Strong Cities Network is in Vilvoorde, where they've used police dialogues and regular meetings as part of their plan to reduce the number of young foreign fighters that were going to Syria. So this program took place over several years ago now. But it became a huge thing, and the police got really, really involved with it. They had huge groups of young people who had never interacted with the police at all suddenly showing up and having these conversations, and they saw really good effects for it just by creating these channels where people could air their grievances. Another common approach is human rights. So extremists feed on victimization as a result of human rights violations. So the feeling of injustice that comes from when someone feels that human rights have been violated, that is huge fuel for any sort of extremist narrative. It's a really, really powerful motivator. So this is a really prominent narrative with IS propaganda, for example. And it's also, unfortunately, become a really powerful narrative in response to the American war on terror. So counterterrorism policies that forsake human rights or restrict civil liberties, they're incredibly counterproductive because they fuel recruitment. So campaigns that really kind of focus in on human rights, they can come in and stand up for human rights. So speaking out against abuses, educating people about their rights, offering alternative opportunities to air grievances or seek justice peacefully. So it's, really bringing that focus back onto human rights and using it as part of a way to start a conversation and change a conversation. Next one. Education. So education is one actually that we do quite a lot at ISD. Our education program is fairly expansive, both in school and out of schools. So it's one of the most powerful tools for primary prevention. And again, you can do it inside of the school, you can do it in community centers, it can be formal, it can be informal. There's a lot of different places that you can do it depending on your target audience. So if you're trying to work with students who are maybe not necessarily all that interested in school, for example, doing in-school programs might not be the best way. You have to find other ways to reach that audience. But in general, there's kind of three broad approaches. So you can educate students directly. You can educate them about all sorts of things. So extremism, critical thinking, critical consumption, digital citizenship, civics, which is especially important in places where there's low trust or poor understanding of the government, peer messaging, mediation, activism. There's a lot of things that you can do with direct education, but you can also train teachers or train youth workers. So education doesn't have to be to the youth directly. You can also upskill teachers and youth workers. And that's another thing that ISD spend quite a lot of time doing through its Extreme Dialogue, where they trained teachers, and then Be Internet Citizens, where they worked directly with youth, but also with youth workers. And then a third approach, so there's initiatives that increase access to education to get more people into education or to keep them in education. Broad overview of education. There's also civil society support. Now, this is something less that individual activists will do and more something that organizations or larger grants will focus on. So the big focus there is closing the resource gap. So civil society is so important because of the unique role that they play in a society, but also in CVE. So civil society organizations often have better knowledge of the community because they're part of that community. They will oftentimes also have more trust, more legitimacy. They're able to operate in critical places and around sensitive topics in a way that others aren't. And they also offer a really important check on the government. So making sure that civil society organizations are strong and able to work really effectively is important. So when we say closing the resource gap, it's not just through money, but it's also through training. So I've done quite a bit of civil society support programs where it's teaching them about CVE and extremism and things, programs that they can take on and approaches they can take on, so that ultimately the CVE and PVE programs are coming from within the community, from community actors. So rather than, international organizations going in and doing the delivery, it's upskilling the organizations that are already there to do the work themselves, because it will ultimately always be more effective when it comes from within the community. The other side of it, so grassroots activism. So these are more so individuals, oftentimes individuals who are not necessarily part of a registered organization, or it could be, a smaller organization But in general, their voices have really unique power because, again, they come from within the community. But sometimes even, they can have credibility even that civil society doesn't, because they're not really formalized actors, so they're less likely to be seen as having an agenda. So they can engage on a level with like an in-group, they can engage on the level of an in-group, so as part of that group through shared experiences, and they can resonate with the group who has like very little trust in the government or establishment, because in a lot of places even trust in CSOs is sometimes quite low because they're seen as either being an extension of the government or they're being seen as part of an establishment. So sometimes these sort of grassroots actors can be much more effective. But again, it's closing that resource gap. It's training. And the way you fund with grassroots activism is different because since sometimes they're not registered, they don't qualify for a lot of the big grants. So one of the things that we've been doing through one of our youth programs called the Youth Civil Activism Network is creating these micro grants to make sure that we can get funding to individual grassroots activists who wouldn't otherwise qualify for grants, to make sure that they can lead on their own work, or just providing them with resources directly. But there's also a lot of potential for networking, so connecting activists that are working in isolation, and just giving them platforms and opportunities to have their voices heard both within their own community, but also with policymakers on sort of local, national, and international levels. So really amplifying those individual voices. And this is a lot of what we do when we say that we work with youth activists. Oftentimes it's this sort of grassroots activism work. Another approach, so religious and interfaith, and I apologize, I know I'm speeding through these, but I just want to give like a good kind of overview. So hopefully some of it's being taken in. So with religious and interfaith, now this is one that's always a little bit tricky, but really, really important. Because obviously the role of religion in radicalization and extremism, it's really hotly debated. And there is obviously no link from one to the other, but we have to face that religion is used as a justification for violence and extremism by some actors. And they do use extremist narrative, they do use religious narratives, and they use religious justifications. And those justifications are still really powerful. So no matter what you think the relationship between faith and extremism is, because extremists have exploited it, it's important. But that being said, that means there is a lot of risk for stigmatizing a group when you do this sort of work, and it can be really, really challenging. And the consequences of alienating a group when you do this are really high. So it's one of those things that has to be done really, really carefully. But these religious, if you're going to work with religious leaders, for example, they just have such powerful, credible voices because they have a certain amount of power over a young person because of their status within the faith. And this power can be critical in radicalizing an individual or be utilized to help prevent an individual from joining an extremist group. So, one approach is working with religious leaders. It's also religious education, campaigns to reclaim religious narratives. So if extremist groups are using religious narratives to manipulate and using them negatively, reclaiming those narratives as part of sort of an education. And then also training religious leaders. So if, because they are such a powerful voice, making sure that they are better equipped, that, if a person asks a difficult question, or if they need to talk about this issue, they're comfortable doing so. Yeah, so again, the religious and interfaith, it can also be about sort of mediating relationships between religious groups or educating about other faiths. That can also be a key part of sort of religious and interfaith campaigning. Another one, so social innovation and entrepreneurship. So this addresses the economic drivers through training and creating opportunities. And it's kind of taking into account that a job is more than just a paycheck. A job, what we do, it's a big part of our identities. It's a big part of our self-worth. And people want to feel that they're contributing to, something. And whereas, volunteering can be good to help fill some of these gaps, ultimately, when someone's in a position where they are economically vulnerable, volunteering is not always an option. So it's making sure that, some of these, the opportunities are something that feel viable for them, for helping create a better future for themselves. Same risk that there was with some of the earlier ones is this the risk of securitizing this. So social innovation entrepreneurship programs should never, probably, I hate to use the word never, but I think I can safely say never be branded as being PVE. So to say, hey, take this, entrepreneurship program because otherwise you're going to become an extremist, is going to alienate whatever audience you were hoping to engage with. So the way that you frame these and the way that you pitch these, and to be honest, I'm hesitant to even include social innovation entrepreneurship under PVE because of this issue, but it can be such a strong driving factor in a lot of cases. So I think it is important, but it's not something that should really be framed as PVE. So, you can do it as part of PVE, but that framing is really, really critical because you never want to securitize, entrepreneurship. It can be really, really counterproductive. And then, I promise there's just a few left. Now, getting into the top of the pyramid. Now, targeted interventions. So this is, well, not the top of the pyramid. This is the middle of the pyramid, I guess. Focusing on sort of at-risk youth rather than broad audiences. So these, counseling, peer mediation, it can be done individual, groups, or families. Reporting, so training people who are prominent in a young person's life to be able to spot the signs of radicalization and flag for intervention. So this often falls on people like parents and teachers and coaches. This was a big part of the UK's Prevent strategy that had mixed results. Because it is something that's quite difficult to do, and it puts a lot of pressure on those teachers and friends and coaches and parents to be able to spot the signs. And it's something that when it's done badly can have serious repercussions. So targeted interventions, they're really important, but it can be really, really hard to identify who needs them and to get the right people into those programs. And then at the top of the pyramid is where you get the disengagement and reintegration. Helping people disengage, offering alternatives, providing a way out, counseling and rehabilitation, and then reintegration is often overlooked and very important. So it's not only are you helping the individual reintegrate into the community, but you also have to prepare the community to accept the individual, especially if that person committed any acts of violence or extremism within the community itself. The community also needs to be included in the rehabilitation efforts. Otherwise, it can go terribly, terribly wrong. And just to keep in mind that the work for both of these is difficult, it's sensitive, and it's potentially dangerous. So as far as targeted interventions and disengagement and reintegration, do not pursue these types of programming unless you are qualified, because you absolutely will ultimately do more harm than good for yourself, for the individual, for the community, and for the effort in general. So it's very unlikely that you will probably engage in this type of work now. There is a way to do this kind of work really, really well. It just takes a huge amount of expertise and training to be able to do it well. And it's not something that should be entered into lightly. Just to keep that in mind. And then last, but absolutely not least, what most people are probably most familiar with is communication campaigns. So these are counter narratives, alternative narratives, counter speech. There's a lot of different names for them. There's a lot of debate about how effective they are. Personally, I think when they're done well, they can be extremely effective, but oftentimes people just don't necessarily do them well. But that's a whole different other discussion. But at the sort of foundation of this is just knowing that extremists, they're very proficient at using communication campaigns for recruitment. They use a huge range of content, videos, music, photographs, blogs, but also one-on-one engagement through social media. They draw on popular culture, global politics, news, but also, you know, the sort of like myths and stories and archetypes of an individual culture. They draw on all of it to be able to make their ideas more relatable and accessible, especially for youth. So it's really, really key that you're able to, within PICVE, we're able to address this communication work. And that means going beyond censorship. You can't just rely on removing things from the internet. I mean, for one, there's way too much content. Most of it isn't illegal because a lot of their communication is not overtly violent or extreme. But also it kind of feeds into these victimhood narratives. It can ultimately be counterproductive that, you know, they're being targeted by some sort of establishment and having their content removed and their voice silenced. And it does nothing to address the idea behind the content to just remove it, and it can ultimately undermine your efforts. So instead, you know, this idea of using communication campaigns to counter extremist ideologies and undermine the narrative that carry them is a way to prevent radicalization and extremism. So whatever you're doing, you never just want to counter, you always want to create and propose an alternative in everything you're doing. They can take place online and offline. Most people think of them as online, but there's also offline communication campaigns that are really, really effective, that take place in some really interesting ways through theater, through music, through performances, street theater. There's ways to take these narratives and take these campaigns out to the community and to the people. Yes, there's a lot of different ways you can do counter narratives. Again, I could do and I do typically do 4-day trainings on counter-narrative campaigns alone. So there's a lot to unpack and dig into with these. But ultimately, no matter what you're doing, there's just a few guidelines to kind of keep in mind. So do your research, never go into something blind. The approach that you take, it depends on the challenges that are facing your particular community. So before you design a program, don't just choose an approach. You need to make sure that your choice of approach is informed. It's going to be the best approach for the community you're working with, the challenges you're facing, the audience. You need to kind of know what, you know, some of those push and pull factors are and what the full extent of the context that's affecting extremism in that situation. So every initiative that you do needs to be grounded in evidence, and therefore it has to start with an information gathering phase. Research, focus groups, talk to people, do surveys, you know, do your research, whatever you do. And part of this research needs to include scoping out existing initiatives to make sure that you're complementing existing work and not duplicating it. There's a lot of resources and time in this field that are wasted recreating things that have already existed or repeating mistakes because they didn't take time to know what other people were doing and learn from it. We need to be more collaborative and work together to create and work toward more effective solutions. And that's only going to work when there's more communication across groups and organizations and teams. Because remember, we're all working toward the same end. When there's funding on the line, it feels like we're competing, but at the end of the day, you know, we're all working toward the same goal, and we need to kind of put that time in together. Know your audience. This sounds really stupid, but like I have to remind people this over and over and over again. Your campaign is not for you, it is for them. So whatever you're doing, don't create something that you like because you like it. Create something that your audience is going to like because it appeals to them. So take the time to figure out who they are, involve them through the very start, and make sure that you test everything along the way. Make sure that you include a credible messenger, especially when you're dealing with sensitive topics. So your message needs to come from a source that your audience can relate to and trust. And then, you know, think outside the box, get creative. Not everything has to be, you know, a dialogue session or a video campaign. Work with content creators. I mean, I'm working with, currently right now working with rappers in Lebanon, Kenya, and Senegal. We work with, you know, actors. We work, you know, across the board to do all of these different types of approaches because we're thinking, how can we best package our message in a way that people are going to relate with? So be as creative as you want, especially if you're speaking to youth. And then big thing is know what all the risks are and have a plan. There's no such thing as an approach that's completely risk-free, but as long as you take the time to know what those risks are and mitigate them, if you can save yourself from any surprises, you'll be good. But yeah, so I think we can move on to the exercise. Excuse me while I dip out of screen for a second. I didn't plug my computer in and it's about to die. But yeah, so you're going to get back into your breakout groups. And then each group has been given a campaign, has been given an approach rather. So you've been given an approach, a goal, an audience, and a challenge. So what you need to do is together create a clear strategy for how you're going to progress towards your goal, and then come up with 1 to 3 activities that are going to meaningfully engage with your audience. Now they can be online, offline, or both, but what I would challenge you to do is be really creative and think outside the box to connect with your audience. All of you have been given young audiences, so that means that you have permission to be as, creative and weird and, unexpected as you want to be. Yeah,
I hope that everybody is back in this meeting room again. I know we had very little time for the exercise. We also don't have the time now to share with each other, but I would like to ask you to send me your IDs. So if you had a nice ID with your group, please just share it with me and I can forward it to the rest of this group and we would be very interested to read it. We have some final points for disclosure. After 1 minute, we're done. But before that, we want to ask you to please fill in the survey that you see on your screen right now. It's also in the chat, and we would be very happy if you could just fill it in because it helps us to learn how we can improve our work also online in these times. After this webinar, we will share the presentation of Kelsey with you, so no worries about that. So you can read everything swiftly. And if Kelsey has any answers or replies to the questions you post in the chat, I will also forward it to all of you. Our next activity will most probably take place in September. This will be the Ren Young review panel in which all of us are going over a couple of practices from the Run collection to review them. Normally we would do this face-to-face in a nice location somewhere in Europe, but now we're not sure how things are going, so this might be an online activity as well. Let me see. That was everything for now. I hope you have enjoyed it. I want to thank Kelsey for her very nice presentation, and I hope you have enjoyed it as well as I did. We talk to you soon again. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me by email or by phone. Thank you for your attendance. Have a good day all.
Thank you.